Hello, students. Hey, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to continue our discussion of living things. Living things. That's right. Yesterday we were talking about the characteristics of living things, and you may remember from yesterday what they are. All living things, and remember the context here, we're talking about living things that we currently know about here on planet Earth. It's possible this list might change at some point in the future, but right now, scientists believe that all six of these characteristics are shared by all living things, starting with made of cells. All living things are made of cells. They have the ability to move and groove to the beat, or at least just move from one place to another, or move part of their body. They have some ability to move. All living things undergo chemical activities. And do any of you remember what one word can be used to summarize all of those chemical activities? And it starts with the letter M. Call it out. Good. Metabolism. Metabolism. And metabolism includes such things as ingestion, digestion, respiration, and our favorite, excretion. Yes. All living things grow and develop. You're bigger now than the day you were born. Your mother's very thankful for that, I am sure. All living things respond to a stimulus. So if I were to pop out of the screen at you, woo, you would probably back up because you'd be responding to a stimulus. And finally, all living things undergo reproduction. They have the capacity as a species to reproduce. So you don't have to ask questions like, well, wait a minute, I'm a boy and I can't reproduce. No, I understand that. As species, living things must reproduce or the species would end. So here is the list of 6 characteristics of living things, which brings us to today's portion of our topic. Hopefully by now your books are opened and you've reviewed your notes, making sure that they are complete from yesterday as we begin our discussion today on the origins of life. This is a topic. See that fly? Woo, wait, other way. See that fly? That's a big fly. I don't have a chip on my shoulder. I've got a big fly on my shoulder. Okay. Anyway, the origins of life. What in the world does a fly have to do with the origins of life? Well, you'll see as I share with you a little story. But before I do, I want to ask you a question. Where do flies come from? Anybody have an answer? Where do flies come from? If you said other flies, then you're correct. When a mommy fly and a daddy fly love each other very much, they produce baby flies. So flies come from flies. We know that today. So our little fly friend here, we know where you came from. But people didn't always know that, believe it or not. I'm introducing another little picture here, a nice slab of meat. Oh, a nice steak. Oh boy, I wouldn't mind going home today and grilling up a big slab of steak on the grill. I love a good piece of meat. But if I didn't eat that piece of meat and we threw it out instead, that would be terrible. That would be a crying shame. Hey, if you don't want the steak, I'll take it. But I want us to think about a story here. I'm going to be telling you a tale of a T-bone and a fly. let's tell a tale of these two things. You see, there was a day when people believed in what was called the spontaneous generation theory. What in the world is that? You are saying to yourself as you are feverishly trying to write this word, this term down in your notes. Spontaneous generation theory. Well, let's dissect it, shall we? Let's take it apart and talk about it before we move on so that we can understand what this thing is all about. First, spontaneous. What does it mean to be spontaneous? Maybe some of you are spontaneous. What does that mean? Somebody, raise your hand. Tell me, share with us. What do you think spontaneous means? Okay, well, spontaneous could mean maybe even explosive. All of a sudden, pop, bam, boom. How many of you know someone who maybe flies off the handle with no warning beforehand? You might call that person a spontaneous person. Or maybe you know someone who just, hey, let's have a party right now. Hey, that's spontaneous too. Spontaneous could be all of a sudden out of nowhere. Could be good, could be bad, but whatever. It's all of a sudden out of nowhere. Generation. Generation. You might think of genealogy and one generation after the next. Maybe your family goes back 20 generations, all the way back to the Mayflower. Who knows? Generation can also mean constructing something, building something, to generate something, like a power plant generating electricity. So producing something. So let's think of this together now. Spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation. Creating something all of a sudden. That's what spontaneous generation means. The quick, automatic boom of something. And in this context, we're talking about living things. Now, the word theory here has to do with, the word theory has to do with an established idea. There was a day when the theory of the origins of life adhered to this idea that flies emerged from non-living things, like rotting meat. In fact, we could write that down here, that the spontaneous generation theory suggests that non-living things come from non-living matter all by itself. So unlike you folks who answered the question, where do flies come from? And you said, other flies. There was a day when people thought flies came from, well, dead stuff, decomposing stuff, unliving stuff, non-living matter. Now, before you judge them too much, let me give you a story to explain this, okay? If you produce garbage, which I know all of you do, you produce garbage at home, and what do you do with your garbage? What do you do, everybody? Throw it out. Now, when you say throw it out, you might just mean you throw it out in the trash can in the kitchen or wherever the trash can might be in your home. But when that becomes full, then what do you do with it? What do you do with that filled trash can every week, folks? Yeah, you take it out for the trash collection, for the garbage people to come and collect your trash, and then they take it and bring it somewhere where you can't see it or smell it, hopefully. They bring it to either the landfill down the road, and if you live close enough to it, you might be able to smell it, or they might bring it to the incinerator up the road, and they burn it and generate electricity from it, right? In either case, they're taking it away from you. Well, that hasn't always been the case. You see, even in the world today, there are places where there is no trash collection. There is no garbage truck. And even in some places today, people just literally, when they throw out their garbage, they literally just throw it out the window and it just stays there. But in some places in the world, towns might get together and gather their garbage together when they throw it out and put it in a big garbage heap in town. The town dump they might talk about. Well, this town dump would accumulate garbage of all kinds over time, and eventually, there'd be rotting stuff in that garbage pile. Now imagine being a kid and you wanted to go and get a good view of the town. Probably the highest elevation around would be that garbage heap. So even though your mom and dad might tell you, don't play in the garbage heap, Junior, you might go there anyway, because you know how good kids listen, right? So they might go to the garbage heap and climb to the very top. And as you're on the top, looking at the view of the town from up there, you might look down as well and see, oh, there's a rotting piece of meat right under my feet. And out of the rotting piece of meat, lo and behold, what do I see? I see a fly coming out of that piece of meat. So if you were to go home and say, Mom, Dad, where do flies come from? Your mom and dad may have had the same experience as you when they were a kid. And they might say, well, Junior, flies come from that garbage heap over there. That's where the flies come from. And based on your observation, you would say to yourself, perhaps, yeah, that's what I saw. That's what I saw. The flies came out of that rotting meat. And that would be a logical conclusion. You might also be standing up there on top of the garbage pile, looking down, and you might see big rats or mice or other kinds of vermin coming out from the pile. And you might conclude to yourself, well, I guess that's where mice and rats come from too. In fact, you might say to yourself, there's a lot of living things coming out of that pile of non-living matter. And you might adhere to this theory called the spontaneous generation theory. Well, people believed that for a long time until someone by the name of Francesco Rinaldi, no, not Francesco Rinaldi. I think he's the tomato sauce guy. This is Francesco Rinaldi, also an Italian, but a scientist. And in the year 1666, just a few years before I was born, he performed a very famous experiment. And this famous experiment finally disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. And it took a while, believe it or not, it took a while for this experiment to be shared with others so that the average person would also agree with Reddy's findings that life did not come from non-living matter. And so I want to share with you this experiment, this famous experiment. You see, in his experiment, he used 3 jars. One jar, the second jar, and the third jar. They were all identical jars or identical containers. He put a piece of rotting meat into all 3 containers. Again, same kind of rotting meat, no difference there. But the one variable between the 3 jars, the first jar he left open, the second jar he put a cloth over top, and the third jar he put a lid on it. And he noticed some differences between these 3 jars. And so we're going to go to the lab right now and perform a little experiment. We're going to perform Reddy's experiment. And so let's talk about this in the lab. So here we have 3 jars. We have an open jar. We have a jar with a cloth on the top. And we have a jar with a lid on the top. That is the variable between all 3 jars. There is a rotting piece of meat in all 3 jars, so that is a control. That is not a variable between them. Now all we need is a fly, and I just so happen to have a trained fly. So I'm going to go get my trained fly and observe what happens to our little fly, our friendly little fly. So, friendly little fly, come out, wherever you are. Where's our friendly little fly? Oh, I see him flying by. Whoa, here he comes. He's getting closer. Whoa, here comes the friendly little fly. All right, he's zooming in to the jars. Which one do you think he's going to go to first, everybody? Call it out loud. What do you think? Which jar do you think he's going to go to first? Call it out. Let's see if you're right. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Oh, he went into the open jar. You were right. Why do you think our trained fly went into the open jar? Yeah, he could smell it really easily, and wow, now he's like chowing down a little bit on that piece of meat. And, oh, wait, settling in. It looks like, little white circles are coming out of the end of our little fly. I wonder what they could be. Oh, done. Oh, he's going to fly around again. Here's the fly flying around again. I wonder what's going to happen. Oh, he's settling down on the second jar. Yeah, he's settling down. He's moving around. Well, he can't reach the meat, but he certainly does smell it. And because he smelled, it looks like there's little white circles coming out of the end of our friendly fly there too, on top of the cloth. And it looks like our fly is done. All right, let's see what else the fly does. Doesn't even look like he's going to land on that third jar. He's just more interested in these other two jars here. But fly, we're finished with your services now, so you can go home there, fly. So we'll let our fly go home, but it looks like he just wants to take a little look at you first. Oh, look at all the friendly folks out there in the classroom. All right, that's enough flying around, fly. Go back home now. All right, very good. Our fly is now home, and now we're going to do a little time lapse. We're going to snap our fingers and several minutes will have passed by. Yeah. Now several days will pass by. Hey, you're still there watching? That's great. All right, several days have passed by now, and I'm observing what's going on in our jars. In the first jar that was open, there's lots of squiggly little maggots crawling around. By the way, if you watch that video link on our notes yesterday, you know what I'm talking about. In the second jar, there's nothing crawling around on the meat, but I see little squiggly maggots on the cloth on the top of the jar. And the third jar, well, there ain't nothing happening there. So let's snap again. Few more days pass. Whoa! There's flies coming out of the first jar. There are flies coming off of the cloth, but they're really skinny flies off the second jar. In the third jar, nothing. Those are my observations. So what does that tell you? Well, let's go back to our notes, shall we? And as we look at our notes here, this is the experiment that Francesco Rinaldi performed, and he showed something. He showed that living things do not come from non-living matter. No. Because if you think about it, in that experiment, the flies didn't come out of the meat. The flies didn't come out of the cloth or the jar of the lid on the jar. Where did the flies come from? If you followed the entire experiment, you would have concluded, like Reddy concluded, well, that the flies came from other flies. It was the flies that were attracted to the meat. It was the flies that laid the eggs. It was the eggs that hatched into maggots. And the maggots that metamorphosed into flies. So the flies went through a life cycle and produced more flies. So Reddy showed that living things do not come from non-living matter, but rather that living things come from living things. It's something we take for granted today. I mean, yeah, it seems real common sense that flies come from flies, people come from people, ducks come from ducks, living things come from living things. But not everybody believes that. And back in Reddy's day, people were basing their conclusion on the observations that they were making. They weren't illogical conclusions, they were logical conclusions. They just happened to be wrong conclusions. And that happens in science. Sometimes you make many, many observations and you may arrive at an incorrect conclusion, in which case the scientific method just repeats itself and goes on, and you try another experiment. And that's great. That's what science is all about. Now, speaking of science, we're going to be performing a lab activity tomorrow. But before we get to that lab activity, I want to discuss with you 6 basic needs of living things, because it's these needs that we are going to be drawing upon with our lab activity tomorrow. So, what are the 6 basic needs of living things? And again, remember, we're talking about life on Earth as we know it. Number 1, the number 1 need of all living things is energy. And for most things on the planet, the primary source of energy is the sun. But it's not the only source of energy. That's a very important point. The primary source here on Earth is the sun. Let me give you, for instance, about 50 years ago, there were some famous explorations being made of the bottom of the ocean. Now, sunlight does not penetrate to the bottom of the ocean. Believe me, it's very, very dark down there. Light cannot penetrate very deep into the ocean at all. So it's complete blackness at the bottom of the ocean. So you might think, well, there couldn't possibly be any life down there because, well, plants can't grow, and plants are usually the beginning of the food chain. Yeah, there are no plants at the bottom of the ocean, but there are living things. Well, again, back to these explorations about 50 years ago, we discovered that there is a different source of energy at the bottom of the ocean for living things. And that source of energy is the Earth itself. We discovered these geothermal vents, these like little mini volcanoes at the bottom of the ocean where heat energy and chemicals from the Earth itself were bubbling into the frigid cold water. And let me tell you something, the bottom of the ocean is only about 2 degrees Celsius. It's like super cold, much colder than we could survive. And yet, the bottom of the ocean has a flourishing ecosystem of living things. Yes. And it's because they do have a source of energy. Nope, it's not the sun. It's the Earth itself. Now think about that in the context of what we mentioned yesterday with the outer solar system and the one moon of Saturn, Enceladus. It has a liquid ocean under an ice covering. Who knows? Maybe there are hydrothermal vents from Enceladus itself, pumping up heat and chemicals into that liquid water. Maybe life exists there. We know liquid water exists elsewhere in the solar system, and we also know that there is thermal energy. We've actually seen volcanic activity taking place along the moons of the outer planets. So heat energy does exist far beyond the reaches of the sun. Think about that as we explore Number two. Number two. Number two is food. All living things need food. And the thing that we need from the food are the nutrients. The nutrients are chemicals that exist in the food that we consume that runs our bodies. Now, whether we're talking about human bodies or microscopic bodies, it's the same deal. Whether we're talking about plants or animals or something else, it's the same deal. All living things, as far as we know, require a food source which provides chemical nutrients to feed upon. That's where those things from yesterday come into play. The metabolism, the ingestion, digestion, respiration, and excretion, that all ties into our basic need of food. Number three, water, and specifically liquid water. It is the liquid water that allows for those chemical activities to occur within a living thing. So we all need liquid water in order to survive. All living things need liquid water. Now, I did mention earlier about the water bear, how water bears can actually survive in frozen water for a period of time and then be reanimated. You know, that's kind of cool. And it kind of makes you think about, well, what could extraterrestrial organisms perhaps endure? What kind of conditions? But here on Earth, living things need liquid water. Number four, oxygen. We get oxygen from the air that we breathe. We, as mammals, have lungs, and we take in the oxygen from the air, and our bodies use that oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Plants on planet Earth take in that carbon dioxide and release oxygen. If you were an aquatic organism like a fish, you might have gills, not lungs, but you'd still be taking in that dissolved oxygen from the water and releasing carbon dioxide. But no matter what kind of a living thing you are here on Earth, you need oxygen in order to survive. Is it possible that living things could depend upon a different element or a different gas other than oxygen? Yeah, it's possible. It is possible. Number five is living space. We all need space. Some of us need more space than others. That's for sure. But every living thing requires a certain amount of space in order to survive. And it's because we all compete for various resources that we require, and resources typically food and water. There is competition going on all the time. I'll give you a quick example. Here in our rural township, this time of year especially, you oftentimes see dead deer on the side of the road. Why is that? Well, it's because they are competing for resources, food and water. And they have limited living space because we've built roads through their habitats. And sometimes they cross those roads. And if we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, well, they can take out our car and we take them out. But it's because all living things need living space. Which brings us to the last one. The last one here is temperature. Temperature. All living things have a limited range of temperatures to survive within. We as human beings, for instance, we cannot survive in temperatures where water can exist in non-liquid forms. For instance, when water freezes, it's really cold. At those temperatures, it's too cold for us to survive if we don't have another source of energy to bundle us up and to heat us up. Likewise, when water gets too hot, it vaporizes, turns into steam. We can't survive in those temperature conditions. Our bodies would literally cook. So we have limited temperature spans. Some organisms have larger, some have smaller ranges of temperatures, but all living things, as far as we know, have a limited temperature span. So there we go. Energy, food, water, oxygen, living space, and temperature, the basic needs of living things. And tomorrow, we're going to be performing a lab activity which relies on our knowledge of these basic needs of living things. So I would like you to study that list for tomorrow so that you can be better prepared for our lab activity tomorrow. And so until then, I'm going to say bye-bye.